Good afternoon, and I'm really happy to be talking to you today about a little aspect of the doctoral research that I've been conducting for the last 3 years, looking at the importance of land manager and owner lived experience and expertise when we're talking about landscape change. And we've focused specifically on tree planting for natural flood management, but we're going to look at some of the sort of wider implications of the work that we've done and what we've found out as well. So hopefully there'll be some really interesting interdisciplinary approaches and different methodologies that can sit within this framework of ecosystems services. So this is Changing Landscapes and the Impact of Land-Based Expertise and Lived Experience. And I wanted to show you my watershed catchment. So we're based in Wales, and we have here a large, very rural agricultural catchment. And in the traditional approach of flood management, we would normally have arisen to this project through an association of a point of risk, where floods were occurring and were causing problems, and then we would look at implementing solutions to solve that specific flood. In the case of natural flood management, we would be potentially looking upstream at landscape management and the catchment characteristics to see how solutions could be created, and then developing those through engagement with the communities, and that normally is going to take some kind of complementary or carrot and stick method of either putting in place regulations or looking at payments, and that's often how these basic ideas have been developed. But we know that flooding, climate change, these are wicked environmental challenges. They're ones where the socio-cultural aspects are entwined and aren't well solved by these traditional technocratic methods. Now, this catchment might look very rural, but it's important to recognise that it is full of people. Significant knowledge is held here outside of the traditional researcher science policy interface. And our methodologies aren't yet adequately allowing us to understand and integrate this knowledge in practice in policy. This is creating barriers to implementation or development of effective policy. See promises for tree planting targets and compare that to number of trees actually planted and percentage of woodland gained. So engagement with land managers, owners and users of a catchment is imperative to developing anything close to understanding these complex socio-ecological landscapes. For example, our carrot and stick approach often assumes an economic driver. This driver exists, obviously. However, our research supports literatures that show that it's one of many drivers, and you've got to solve the economics. But if you solve it, it doesn't necessarily solve the other many things that are being taken into account in regards to decision making. So we need to have a look at this decision making, and let's start with a simple choice. Let's travel from A to B across a field. Now, the obvious economic approach would be to go in a straight line that's going to be most efficient for fuel. But there are other drivers that are impacting what makes that choice. For example, the weather and the technology. Are you on a shielded tractor, or are you driving every day into prevailing winds? What are the contextual tasks? What's taking place in the field, before it, after it? What about the aesthetic view? What are you seeing as you're travelling around? Maybe you've chosen a specific route because that's where the view is. And what about the slope conditions, expertise in the physical characteristics? Is there slippage due to the hydrology of the catchment and how steep it is? So that's a very simple choice, and yet there's a number of factors taking place. What if we make this a more complicated choice? Tree planting for natural flood management. Where are you going to plant those trees? Well, of course, as well as those socio-cultural factors, there are a whole cluster of additional factors based on the ecology, the biophysics, silviculture management choices, and requirements for the landscape itself tied up into the sociocultural geomorphic system. We're considering the person's perspective and point of view, how they behave in relation to the history of the landscape, how the landscape is shaped due to its history, alongside and within the ecology of the species that we're looking at themselves. How will they interact? Pests and beneficiaries, patterns of growth, mycology, where are the nutrients and water? What about the root interception or the surface roughness? How will they actually impact hydrology within the catchment? We're tying together here ideas from many different disciplines. Now, how do we start to understand landscape ecologies in such a way as we might create direct action for wider benefit? I've added here a suggestion of the disciplines that have been involved in understanding this catchment landscape. And you can see that we need to start using adaptive different methodologies that can tie together some of these ideas to get us to understand how the landscape might adapt and how the people within that landscape might adapt to future changes. This particular scenario was actually gathered as data. It's not this field, but the scenario itself is one that came up in discussion with a few farmers based on some of the different access and the choices that they made, and they were explaining why these choices were linked to so many different factors. So we used integrated methodologies to start to collect this data, and some of the key aspects that we used were semi-structured interviews, and as part of that, participatory mapping. So I used scaled maps, which just had simple field boundaries on for very specific reasons that I don't have time to go into today. But these maps could be redigitized and then accompany GPS photography, secondary and remote sense data to really get a perspective of information about the catchment. So these maps give us different types of data and different types of information. They were sometimes used for storytelling, for giving information about history or cultural choices. Sometimes they were used to emplace the researcher and the participant to be able to say, we are here. And sometimes they were used for very specifically identifying physical characteristics of the land that would affect either the hydrology, like drainage systems, or the ability of different trees to grow on different sites, looking at key information in regards ecology and specific sites of importance. So we've collected data from across the catchment from a number of participants, and then how is that then applied? Well, there's a very, very rich range of uses. You have to take into consideration very important factors like uncertainty at different spatial and temporal scales. So we were set up particularly for our use, which was the application looking at NFM modelling. Obviously, getting information about tree planting and getting observed data is very difficult when you're looking at heterogeneous catchments and tree growth over a long period of time. So our application of this dataset to NFM modelling meant that we were able to look at scenarios for tree planting that may affect the catchment hydrology and see how that might happen at different scales, and make sure that the types of tree planting we were looking at were informed by the physical and sociocultural data so that they were relevant to that specific catchment and the culture within that catchment. And that turned out to be really important, and the heterogeneity of the catchment. Usual NFM targets techniques wouldn't necessarily have the same effect in all locations within this catchment. They weren't as suitable, or they weren't going to be as effective as different techniques. For suitability, for example, small wet areas tended to be very biologically and ecologically diverse, and therefore would be considered worth protecting rather than planting, whereas often they can be a target. In addition, looking at those areas, those necessarily weren't as effective as techniques such as letting hedgerows expand to shelter belt, introducing wood pasture, or coppice in different techniques and areas. But again, some of the evidence for these different techniques can be uncertain in different catchments, what the outcomes are going to be. And they can take place at different scales, both spatial and time scales. It's very difficult to gain observed evidence. So this brings us to kind of 3 key points, and it really comes back to the importance of that land manager lived experience and expertise. We know that landscapes are complex, integrated socioculturally, ecologically, and place-based. The very shape of the landscape carries our history and culture and ecology. We need integrated methodologies to understand these systems and to cross these divides between different disciplines and different knowledges. This example is just one case study. There are a number of different ways that we can address this using similar ideas, but being place-based is a really good start. However, we need to look at building on place-based knowledge, lived experience and expertise from the very start of our projects and our processes. The knowledge and experience that was held within this catchment not only made the findings relevant to the people who lived there, but they held very specific environmental, scientific expertise that was not accessible in any other way to the researchers. So I would just like to emphasise that importance of engagement with the people who have access to or not certain landscapes, and the importance of different types of expertise and lived experience, and that there are methods we can use to start working with this data. Thank you very much for your time. My details are here. I'm looking forward to answering any questions or being in touch either throughout the conference or afterwards. Many thanks.